Okay, well, look, welcome everybody. I'm Frank Bongiorno, and I'm president of the Council for Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. And I'm speaking today from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I would like to take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders, people, and country. And please feel free to acknowledge the lands and peoples on which you're zooming in from in the way that's become customary in chat, if you would like to do that. Um, Welcome to this event. It's a Social Sciences Week event. CHASS under Dan Woodman has had I think, a strong involvement in Social Science Week in recent years, and this is one of our contributions to the range of activities that occur this week, as a way of celebrating the importance and impact of the social sciences in Australia. And CHASS is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and of course has a broader remit, very appropriate, I think, for tonight's event, because I guess we're dealing with the humanities, arts, and social sciences all at once tonight, and it's going to be, I think, a really wonderful event. Let me get into that. The event itself is a conversation between Vic McEwan and myself. And the reason for that is that Vic was the winner in 2023 of CHASS's Distinctive Works Prize. And I won't sort of read out the whole citation for that prize. I don't think we need to go quite that far, but it was for Vic's Face-to-Face, The New Normal, which was an exhibition that has also been the subject of Vic's doctoral work. And I will just read out the first two lines of the CHASS citation. The panel selected Vic's work due to its distinctiveness, the crossover between HASS and medical science, together with the significant, beautiful and tangible outcomes of the project. And we'll be hearing more about those in a few moments. Vic is a contemporary artist whose practice aims to contribute to and enrich broader conversations about the role that the arts can play within our communities. He's artistic director and co-founder of the Cad Factory, which actually won the Distinctive Works Prize a few years ago, actually. I think that's testament to the impact and importance of the work that Vic and his colleagues there have undertaken. That was for the harmonic oscillator. We could perhaps talk briefly about that a little bit later for those who are unfamiliar with that earlier work. But Vic's artistic practices, we'll hear, is a very interdisciplinary one involving sound, video, installation, photography, performance, and with a strong emphasis on site-specific locations and place. And in particular tonight, we're going to be talking especially, I think, about the intersection between Vic's artistic practice and the whole world of medicine, which was very much at the heart of the work that Vic has undertaken for his doctorate, and which was the basis for the award. And I'll just read very briefly. Again, we're not going to sort of have extended readings of examiners' reports or anything of that sort, but I'm going to read two brief extracts from those reports, because again, I think they give a great indication. One of them said, "This is outstanding work, and full credit to McEwan and his supervisory team for producing such a careful, critical and artful thesis. These elements rarely come together with such distinction and integrity." And with the other examiner, "This is an extraordinary initiative which has been worked out in a magnificent way. The inclusion of socially engaged arts practice in the clinic is visionary. The thesis and creative work resulting in the exhibition demonstrating art therapy are unique." So I think, we're in for, I think, a wonderful discussion of this work tonight. So welcome to everyone, and welcome to Vic. So I really wanted to begin not so much with that project, but actually to ask you about the broader issue of place. So yes, your art is grounded in site and place, and I'd like to begin there. And could you say a little bit about the Cad Factory, of which you're artistic director, And what do you see as the place of the arts in Australia's regions? I mean, why do they matter for the regions, and perhaps also, why does regional art matter for the country more generally?
Yeah. Well, the Cad Factory is an arts organisation that's run by myself and my partner, Sarah McEwan, and we have Kimberly Beattie, who works with us 3 days a week. And, we're a core team that expands and grows for various projects. So we might bring in other artists or community members or non-arts partners, people from other sectors that we want to partner with to make work for specific projects. And time we've also been involved in advocacy around regional arts practice. And so, when you think about the need for that, I think you can think about two different aspects of that. So one of those aspects is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that, every individual has a right to access culture and the arts. And so if you take that as a given, as the declaration does, then that brings with it a responsibility for us to make the necessary investments required so that all people in our country have access to those things. And so one way to think about that is in terms of the necessary investments that we need to make in terms of things like infrastructure and access to programs, etc. But then another way to think it through is that, if we accept the idea that storytelling through the arts is one of the best ways to share the Australian story or Australian stories, so whether it's through film or music or dance or visual arts, if we sort of acknowledge that as being true, which I do, if we fail to make the necessary investments to have creative regional communities, then we continue to miss the voices of certain people in our national storytelling. And so I think, one of the things that are important to us is to do the work of identifying where there are missing voices and creating opportunities for those to exist. And I think, we have to be careful in how we do that. It's not just about infrastructure, and it's not just about city-based organisations touring cultural product to the regions. It's also about creating cultural communities where young people can grow up identifying that arts and culture is something that they can explore, that it has some value and some worth, and maybe through that they can also contribute to others, if not just to themselves. So how do we create those opportunities for smaller regional communities to be able to see other people making work, other people failing, other people succeeding, all of those types of things. And so I think, an example of that is in 2019 and 2023, we had, which some people will remember, the major fish kill events in Menindee, New South Wales. So in 2019, 1 million fish appear floating dead on the banks of the Darling Barker River. In 2023, it was 30 million fish dead on the banks of the river there. So this is, one of the biggest, or two of the biggest environmental catastrophes our nation's ever faced that have happened. And in 2019, there was quite a lot of media noise about this event. And in 2023, despite the fact there was now 30 million dead fish that appeared floating on those waters, there was much less storytelling about it. And so, this is a regional story that affects everybody. So, through the arts, it's one of the ways that the Cad Factory as an organisation has been working with those communities to help tell those really important stories that it's really easy for people in other places to forget or just not have access to.
Thanks, Vic. And I mean, obviously the Cad Factory brings together artists, but medical faculties and health services usually don't. I guess that's where we'll talk more tonight. No, I wonder if you could tell us a little about the path that's taken you as an artist into, well, these days, your involvement in the Sydney Facial Nerve Service. I imagine it's something that you wouldn't have anticipated a decade ago, and so I'm really interested about how that's happened, what kind of work you did before that, and yeah, I mean, basically the kind of pathway that's led to that turn to what you've called in your work, the clinical exploration of illness and trauma.
Well, I think, it's been a slow and organic journey. So, in our younger years, we were musicians, had maybe, a trashier musician existence, all-night parties playing music. And actually, the Cad Factory started in Sydney as a sort of underground venue for music, which we also lived in. And so, that then expanded while we were still in Sydney to involve visual arts exhibitions once a month as well, but all very much just part of a community. Sometimes we didn't even advertise the events. They just happened and were always full of people. And then we purchased an old schoolhouse out in Narandra, so 6 hours drive from Sydney, 100 kilometres west of Wagga Wagga. And what that move did, unexpected to us, was just shift our focus as we started to be exposed to different things. So one thing was just the landscape as it was, the big infrastructure that appeared in those landscapes. We got deeply engaged with some of the really important Wiradjuri storytelling of the First Nations communities in that region, which are really strong and vital to that region. But then also complex things like water allocation, something when I lived in the city, I didn't even understand what it was, but now I understand how much it affects everybody in the city, because it affects not only our environmental climate, but it affects food and fibre production. And so I think this was just a very sort of slow and organic change that happened in the things that we had access to participate in. It meant that, on reflection, we realised that when we lived in Sydney, we had a community of people around us who were very like-minded, same ideological background, mostly in the arts. And then living in a regional centre, what happens is you create a community of friends and collaborators, peers who aren't necessarily from the same world as you, from the same ideological background as you. So you're exposed to really different ways of being in which you coexist and which you learn how to form community with. And I think that change, I think there's some parallels to how our practice changed and the realization of that change that regional living brings to you. And so, we devised some projects, for example, in a town where we worked with the community for a year after it was flooded, looking at how does a community recover from that event in a town where the majority of houses were lost without insurance. Also, some of the community responses to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan back quite hostile. There's lots of violence, lots of people burning the plan on the steps of council, for example. And so I think over the years, we have just we started making work quite organically. It started stepping outside more. It started involving the lives of other people more. And each time we sort of just saw, we could witness and we could feel and we could touch and observe and be part of something else that was happening through these projects. And it really just opened our eyes to these other potentials that exist in the arts. And so move along to now where we'll say through my PhD work, working right in a medical clinic, a controlled clinical environment, trying to understand how to navigate the world. And so I think what the shift has been for the Cad Factory into this making a practice, whether it's in a clinic or not in a clinic, whether it's in a river in Menindee, I think it's all around, trying to understand how we can sort of contribute to making the world that we want to be in. So one way you can go and agitate for change out in the community, or you can just enact the change. You can just live it and you can deliver it through your work. And I think that's sort of one of the paths that I don't think at first was very obvious to us that's what was happening, but I think that's the journey that we've had.
Yeah, so kind of, you had a socially, culturally community, I guess, embedded practice long before the work that you've been doing more recently. But so yes, it's a story of continuity, I guess, in a way that I didn't really understand. So if we could perhaps come to that, I mean, it is a remarkable thing. You completed a doctorate in a faculty of medicine. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about what that experience was like, not just for you, but also for the medical academics that you were working with. And of course, we'll talk about the patients as well in due course. But I wondered what that experience of working within a medical faculty as an artist was like for you.
It was scary, and so no, but I say that with a lot of love. So it was really fascinating. So my supervisory panel that we assembled from a PhD, which some of whom might be here tonight in this conversation, consisted of Dr. Susan Colson, who was one of the founding members of the Sydney Facial Nerve Clinic and comes from a clinical background. There was also Dr. Claire Hooker, who comes from a medical ethics, having that kind of, her discipline is around the ethics of health and medicine. And Dr. Paul Dwyer, who came from an performing arts mostly background. So, you know, I assembled this panel where at first I was thinking I would enroll in the arts, but still have this multidisciplinary panel of clinic, but have my enrollment in the arts. But then it was really through some conversations with Susan Colson, who just really talking about, well, if one of the things that I'm talking about is making change in both the arts and medicine, then why not take that bigger challenge of seeing, well, first, if I would get accepted into a medical faculty as a contemporary experimental artist. As a contemporary experimental artist who was arguing, I don't want to define my practice before I go in. This has to be responsive to the human encounter that I have in this space. So something that's very different, I think, for a medical faculty. I think initially my biggest fear was that my knowledge and the skills that I brought wouldn't be valued in that context. And knowing that a PhD would be hard enough anyway, I didn't want to add that sort of extra thinking nobody really trusts me here, or nobody puts value in my work. But Susan went and did all of that internal work within the faculty to have those conversations. I remember meeting the head of research after I was enrolled, who was saying, I remember the day I was walking across the quadrangle and Susan said, now I just want to have a discussion with you about something. It's a bit unusual. And she broached this subject of an artist enrolling in the Faculty of Medicine and Health. But, you know, I must say that I felt really supported the whole time in the university sometimes there was, you know, we didn't quite understand each other. And that was what part of this journey was about. For me, it was about one of the reasons I wanted to put my enrollment into medicine was because I wanted to take the claim that I make really seriously, that I can speak to other disciplines through the arts, that we can speak to multiple perspectives and multiple voices with one voice through the arts. So that's a claim the Cad Factory might offer. To really need to actually be tested on that, to put my enrollment in a Faculty of Medicine and Health. At my request, the two examiners were one from medicine, so one was a surgeon and one was from the arts. So again, I had to write a thesis that both of those disciplines would pass. And so that got through with no changes required, which was astonishing because I was preparing myself for many months of potential changes, possibly from the medical examiner, who knows. But, you know, it was really astonishing. And that was really what I wanted to do. So I don't think I could have really done that without the support I had from Susan, Paul, and Claire, because really one of the many things that they did was keep reminding me, you know, yes, this part of your thesis, for example, might be acceptable in the arts world, but you came here with the desire to enroll in medicine and to make changes in medicine. That brings a responsibility for you to understand how you're going to present this thesis in medicine, make decisions about where you want to push disciplinary traditions, for example, and where you don't want to, and why you're doing that when you're doing that, and to do that respectfully. And so it was a really big journey. And then I think on the other end of that is the clinicians in the facial nerve clinic, who I think, as you would expect, some of them were a bit puzzled by the idea of why is there a contemporary artist in this controlled medical space? But really, I think the majority of those clinicians, because they were also my participants in my research, so I could interview them one-on-one, and we would have frank discussions about their opinion of me and my place there in the clinic. And, you know, they saw over time, which again became part of my journey, because I realized, why would they understand why I was there? So that actually, this is my responsibility now to be able to articulate myself here in a way that they can see, because I shouldn't assume that they would understand my presence. So that's a responsibility I have. So yeah, it was a really fascinating journey.
Thanks, and I see Susan's here. So greetings, Susan. And maybe Susan might even wish to contribute later when we get to questions up. But I wanted to ask you about the particular nature of the work you were doing, Vic, and to talk a little about facial nerve paralysis, which was very much the subject of the exhibition and your doctoral work. And you know, why did you see that as something with which you wish to engage as an artist? I mean, why was that important to you?
Well, I had been thinking about undertaking a PhD, and I wasn't really pressured to do it. It had just been on my mind. I was thinking that my practice seems to have all these elements underneath it that are on the way towards a PhD. So why not expand that out even further? And I was giving a talk about a previous work that I did in the UK in the children's hospital there over 4 years. And Dr. Susan Colson was at that talk. And she came and introduced herself afterwards, and we were just talking about our work, and she was telling me her thoughts on, what my presentation had raised for her. And, she hadn't had any experience of working with an artist in the clinical space, for example, but I think she was, as she might mention later if we speak to her, what she said to me at the time was what really struck her with the presentation I gave then was about trust. So, part of, as a clinician, what she's doing is building trust with patients. And when she was looking at work I was talking about when I was working with, say, young people in palliative care, families, what sort of struck her was how did I build that trust up as an artist in that space? And that's what sort of, she could see it was there. And so then she started telling me about the facial nerve clinic. And what really got me, it was really just one sentence of hers that I was instantly in it, where she started, because of course I didn't know what the facial nerve was or what it did or what facial nerve paralysis meant. And she was explaining it to me. And then one of the things she said was people with facial nerve paralysis have trouble with expressing emotion on their face through facial expression. It's obviously not the only way we express emotion, but it's a major way that we present to society and express how we feel. And it was just that sentence, it just seemed like such a profound thing to me. What does that mean? What must that be like? And it was kind of similar, I think, in the process, when you're in the studio making work, there's a lot of decisions that you're making constantly. And I think a lot of those decisions are not necessarily cognitive, they're felt, and you feel through them, and you just make decisions, and you know something that's complete now, or I'm going to take this journey now, and you might not have the words for it. And I think it was one of those, it felt very similar to me, because just that sentence and the way Susan talked about it, I just felt, this feels so intriguing. And so imagine having the opportunity to be involved in that and experiencing what that must be like. And so then Susan invited me to the clinic to come and observe, which I did, which was really confronting to be in that sort of situation. But I left there sort of feeling, I think I'm doing a PhD now, and I think this is what I want to do. I've started. It might take me months to enroll, but I'm going to start now.
I found the story of that collaboration, Vic and Susan, really inspiring. I mean, that you're both able to recognise those possibilities, I think, says a great deal about, well, obviously about you, but also just about your intellectual openness. And I think it's a wonderful story. But yeah, I guess I want to ask you about the face. I mean, the face obviously has great significance in life and art, in terms that you just described, Vic, around the emotions, but also, I guess, in terms of our identities, how others relate to us. And I was wondering how your own work, especially with those suffering from paralysis, has influenced your thinking on that issue. I'm sure you've thought all about faces long before this as an artist, but I just wondered how, I guess, this experience has changed your views and perspectives on that.
Yeah, well, I think maybe beforehand, my interest wasn't necessarily in the face, but more about how we present or are received in the world, and all of the many barriers and factors, spoken or unspoken, that contribute to that. And I think, so much of the work that we as the Cad Factory are doing is trying to understand that or explore that or improve that or something. And then, obviously the face is the thing that it's what we're judged by. It's the first thing people look at. There's research to fast, in less than a second after seeing your face, people are making judgments about your intelligence, not just your beauty, but your intelligence, your capacity, all of that sort of thing. But then, when speaking to people about the face for the last 4 years, as I have, you also discover that you don't just have to be presenting to the world with facial difference in order to feel uncomfortable about your own physical appearance, the way you present to the world. It doesn't take long to sort of prod into someone until you find people's concerns about their own facial appearance and their identity through their face, before we even add on the whole traumas of facial difference. And so, facial paralysis means that you potentially, depending on your pathology and how you recover and everything, means that you potentially present to the world and psychological, reconfiguring of yourself that has to happen here in order to decide, well, do I want to lock myself off, socially isolate myself and not engage with the world, or do I develop new mechanisms in which I continue to engage with the world, and how do I have the strength to do that, for example? And so I think we can see all the research that tells us about the increased rates of depression and anxiety, etc., for people with facial nerve paralysis. And it's interesting. I think one of my general observations I had in the clinic is that, I think generally people's own perception of themselves and the way they're presenting to the world is often much worse, much more negative than others. I know even with facial nerve patients that I observed, often the way they would describe how they looked seemed much more extreme than how I would describe it as somebody who was observing them. Yet they felt that, that they were presenting to the world with of identity. Many patients talking about not recognizing themselves in a mirror, or at another extreme, a patient talking about, well, I just don't consider myself to have a physical self anymore. So these sort of various different types of reflections, which are really deep, they're really deep reflections if we're thinking about this thing that we mostly identify our identity with. But then it also causes other things. So, if you're a classical French horn player and can no longer get the embouchure to play your instrument, your identity that you're built as that person through a lifetime of this mastery and relationship with an instrument means that identity is gone too. So, do we have space within our clinics to actually nurture, care for that type of loss of identity, in our busy, overrun medical clinics? So I think this is one thing that bringing the arts into the clinical space, rather than me just responding to these things separately, enabled us to give time to some of these deeper considerations that
Thanks. Well, Vic, perhaps you could tell us about that particular artwork. I want to get a sense of the kinds of responses that face-to-face has elicited more generally. But yes, your French horn player, I think, is an extraordinary story. Could you tell us a little bit about that particular case, that particular work that you did?
And I think, that patient was a professional French horn player, so then lost the ability after the removal of a brain tumor, which had to cut her facial nerves. So, she wouldn't get the use of those again. And so it meant that embouchure, her ability to get the mouth shape required for the French horn, was gone. And so we started working together. And so, the first time was at the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse just after she came out of an operation. So, sometimes I'd spend time with patients in the clinic and they'll be examined, or then later after or before treatment. But then we continued just talking on the phone or via email or via Zoom, me interviewing. So in terms of my PhD, it was me doing interviews with her. And in the one time where I asked her, can I on the French horn, is that acceptable for you? And she said, oh, yes, please do. So I sent her a number of questions, and then the next day I received really lengthy answers to all of them. And it was great because in her reply, she said, I've also forwarded this on to my parents because you seem to have asked me some questions that they've forgotten to ask me for some reason. And so, one of the outcomes of that was that her parents then organized a family conference to come together to have conversations that they've realized they haven't had with her. So it meant what happened through this artist having an engagement with this patient around their relationship with the French horn, with music, meant that it had this other family outcome where people came to have conversations that nobody before. And so then in our ongoing conversations, I said to her one day, how would you feel about unraveling a French horn? Because I've done some research and found that there's something like 13 feet roughly of piping in a French horn. And I figured some professional French horn players, knowing, for example, her French horn, as many classical musicians, cost something like $30,000. She might be quite offended by unraveling one, but she was quite open to it. And so we talked about doing that. Is it possible? I spoke to some metal workers that I knew, some sculptors, and then I actually approached a brass musical instrument shop that sells brass instruments during COVID lockdown. email explaining the facial nerve clinic, explaining what I want to do with. They wrote back to saying that this is the weirdest email I've ever received. I'm glad it's COVID because yes, I will help you with this. And he actually found us a French horn, and then every Thursday when his shop shut, I would go there and we would slowly try to unravel it. And so then we made this installation with her that was, because when she was going to have her brain tumors removed, she knew that the facial nerve would be cut. And so she knew she was going to lose the ability to play the French horn. And she had already organized, she'd purchased a cello. And her mother later told me that when she was released from the hospital, she drove straight to the music shop, picked up her cello and went home. So she had planned on that. Where do I put my musical skills? So in their final exhibition of Face to Face, that work appeared as this unraveled French horn, quite a beautiful form and shape. And it was installed sort of upright so that the bell of it was facing out sort of at head height to a tall audience member. But then I did a recording of her playing the cello, and down the bottom in the mouthpiece, we put a tiny speaker. And so the sound of her playing the cello was kind of piped through the tubing of the horn and came out of the bell of the French horn. And so that was the installation that people saw in the gallery. But she brought her entire family to that. So her elderly parents, her brother, his kid. They all traveled to the exhibition and spent 2 days there. I left them on their own on the first day so they could just see it as a family. And the second day I met them and had conversations about what it meant for her, not only to see her story or her story shared, but the benefits that she felt from sitting and seeing the other works, hearing the stories of other people. Because I think that's what a number of the patients I worked with talked about, wanting more access to others who have experienced this thing so that they don't feel so alone.
It's an extraordinary story, Vic, and an extraordinary work. And I wanted to ask you a bit more about music. I mean, it's interesting to learn that music was sort of at the origins of the Cad Factory, and it does seem so important to your art in all sorts of ways. Perhaps ask you to expand a little bit on the role. I mean, obviously, sound is one of those things that you work with, but I wondered more generally about music.
Well, I think, we've always had, Sarah's a drummer, plays piano, I play various instruments. And, we have a recording studio. We record still albums for people, engineer them. And so often, in these other types of projects that we do, sound raises its head in there in various kind of ways. Because I think one reason that's one of the ways I think through the world is through sound. But also I think it's really valuable in terms of, say, a clinical experience, and even not just a clinical experience, but other complex experiences that, we can understand the arts through visual arts, through what we see. But also, if the more that we can bring in the ability to receive information through our other senses, the more information we're receiving, and potentially the more impact we can have. And so I think part of, for me, it's part of just that, we all know we have a teenage daughter and we see that sort of the emotional quality of the music she's listening to now. She's turned 13 changing, and I love it. But it's that, we think about, in those stages of life that we use music as an emotional navigator, I guess. And so I think that means that often that sort of appears in work that we do as either music or sound. So thinking about sound in terms of sound art or something more textural, that's sort of trying to evoke emotion rather than narrative per se, trying to evoke a sensation. And so I think it's just, partly because it's the way we think, but also because of just what we've viewed or experienced as the support that it can give to the entirety of an artwork.
I mean, that interdisciplinary character, I guess, of your work is really striking, Vic. And I mean, you work, as you say, in sound and sculpture, photography, projection, performance, installation, 3D scanning. I wondered about the importance of that. I mean, clearly it is about the senses, that very broad sense of how art can be experienced. It's not just something, I mean, when I read about your work and look at your work, it rejects this idea, I think, of art as being a kind of finished object that sits on a wall to be looked at. I mean, that's the upper end of the from what you seem to do, Vic. I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. I mean, is that sort of, I mean, how does that kind of relate to, your notion of a socially engaged practice? Is it about building new audiences, unfamiliar audiences for your work that, audiences that don't, for instance, routinely walk through galleries looking at paintings, that sort of, wider audience?
Yeah, well, I think maybe a way to start is to say that I think, for me, one of the roles of the arts is to help us to have the ability to ask some of the questions that we seem to fail to ask of ourselves and of our world, and then to move beyond the questions, to move towards ways to hopefully move towards change. And so I think, interdisciplinarity for me is really important to my practice. Because I personally like that journey. So it's a personal thing. We're developing a practice that, because it's socially engaged, brings with it an ethical responsibility, but that doesn't deny the fact that I'm there as an artist. So it means that not only do I have a responsibility for the artisans to have some sort of quality, whatever that might mean to you, so that might be contentious for some, but whatever that means to you. But it also means that, I need to feel some sort of artistic satisfaction with my processes. Otherwise, I'm just extracting this skill from myself rather than nurturing it and growing it. And so, I want to nurture my practice as well as nurturing the world is what I'm trying to do through my work. And so I think, interdisciplinarity means that, there's reoccurring sort of themes and processes that happen in a lot of these projects, but I think we're also interested in interdisciplinarity, whether that's by inviting other artists. So often, when we collaborate with other artists, I know that I love collaborating with artists who come from a discipline that isn't my discipline at all. That's really exciting to me. And then for myself, it's just, I think I'm just trying to develop multiple ways to explore the complexity. These stories are really complex, and we have, so what not many people know is, for example, I'm completely comfortable with going into a gallery and changing a work after I've installed it, 100% comfortable. But, I went into the exhibition of Face to Face, and not even sure if I told Susan this, I might have though, changed the sounds in one of the installations after it had opened, because emotionally it made more sense to me. And I only did it for a little period of time because I needed to explore something in that, and then I went and changed back. And so I think part of sort of understanding, part of trying to dismantle that kind of modernist notion of the artist as the hero and the art object as the pinnacle is also saying, well, maybe when the art object goes into these gallery spaces, if that's where they are, maybe once they're in there, the relationship might change. And so we should therefore feel comfortable with the work changing, potentially. And I'm totally comfortable with that.
The term that kept coming to mind was relational. It does seem to be very much a relational kind of art, and very process orientated. There's obviously a reflexivity about the actual process of creating art. And I wondered about the way that relates to, your concerns around empathy and ethical practice. I can entirely see how the kind of change you just described, could come out of a deeply ethical practice, one that is concerned not with the artist as hero, but with how one is relating to a particular site and to a particular audience and to a particular moment, I guess, in your own life as an artist.
Yeah, I think, this word, well, I think, I think about social engaged practice as a negotiation between ethics and aesthetics. So I'm trying not to deny my role as an artist, because I exist and I'm there, and that's what my title is. So I have a responsibility around that. So as I was saying before, I need to nurture my practice, but it's in constant negotiation with the ethical responsibility of basing your life intertwined with the lives of somebody else. And so there's massive ethical responsibilities that lie there. And I think that word relational, if you want to start to try to define social engaged practice, that word relational, I think, is right up there. It's a word that's up there. So if you go and look in medicine around research around the concept of care, what care means, you'll find all that research in nursing, and you'll find language such as relational. If you go and look at the concept of care ethics, which came through feminist scholars, you will find things such as relational being right there as key to those. So I think it's sort of following those lineages, but in an art context.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, so in this kind of ethical, it's interesting you raising empathy, because maybe a few years ago I would have thought, well, I think our work is about empathy. I think this is what it's about. But during my PhD, I really found a lot of resonance with a philosopher called Emmanuel Levinas. And so Levinas, who is considered by some to be talking about the ethics of ethics, when I started reading and rereading, because I was trying to understand it, and it was complicated, Levinas, and, because maybe in a very fast nutshell, Levinas's overriding concept is about meeting the other in a non-predefined way, so that the other person is always unknowable to me, and that I need to meet them without me having contained them in understanding. And so Levinas's work is throughout my PhD, and it's really helped me to think through all of those. Actually, this is actually how we practice. This is really relevant here. And so it sort of made me think over this period of time about moving beyond the concept of empathy. And so if we understand, empathy is a really good word, because the word itself has an art origin. The actual word empathy comes from a German word of aesthetics, which talked about feeling into an artwork. And then that work was adapted towards the concept of empathy. And so if you think about, maybe the most standard definition of empathy being about, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, understanding the perspective of the other person so that you can respond in a caring manner. Thinking through Levinas, it makes me ask, why do I need to understand the other person in order to care for them? Why can't I care for somebody without understanding them? Why do I have to define them and know their situation and feel it in order to be able to care? And so I think, that's, in a flippant way, I might say that, that renders empathy unethical, but in a more stable, steadfast way, I would say that, to me, it's about thinking beyond empathy. I want to, through this work, not need to define the other person in order to care for them or their situation.
Yeah, I mean, this is deeply interesting to me as a historian, because I think our relationship as a discipline has shifted towards empathy as well. I mean, the training I had, was very much in that social history and a tradition where empathy was central. But yes, I think in recent decades, the concept of empathy has been problematized, because I think of the dangers of projection, that notion that you can somehow connect in this deeply affective, personal way, can be a kind of form of self-deception, actually. Very interesting parallels there, I think, with what we do.
Yeah, that's fascinating to know. Yeah.
I mean, getting back to face, the new normal exhibition, could I ask you a little bit more about the kinds of responses that it's elicited? And I'm thinking they're not just of the audiences that have seen it in galleries and so on. But really also, from the medical professionals that you're working with, and particularly, I think, from patients and their families. I mean, what has it meant to them, do you think?
Well, I touched on Liz earlier and bringing her family down to see that exhibition, and it was really meaningful. The father came and for helping him to understand what his daughter was going through. So that was his words. And so I think what I kind of experienced in terms of patients' response to the work was one about the response to the process of making or spending time together. And I think one thing that my process did in this work was it enabled me to spend quite significant time with all of the people that I worked with, so many, many, many hours. And I think that in itself, just that human connection is one of the benefits of this work. As one of the participants said to me when I was asking about what they got from this process, she was saying, it was because you would come and ask me questions, but it wasn't just that you were asking me. I could tell that you were interested. You wanted to know the answer. And so that just made me feel, well, it's an unusual situation. I'm in, sitting in a hospital with an artist talking about the facial nerve, but this is a human being who wants to, I can tell they're genuine here. And so I think a big part of it is just about that, the genuine relationship. And then I think, because there was also an offer to people to be, to make work with me, or would we work together talking about ideas, then I would make the work. And that's always in these types of projects, and I change throughout them, because there's issues around authorship and whose story is it to tell and all of these sorts of things. But in the context of the facial nerve clinic, what happened each time was that people who participated with me talked about not wanting the burden, as one person put it, of having to be responsible for making the art, but they wanted to see what happened if they went on this journey with me as an artist about their experience. And so that was really, it meant that, every sort of decision I made, I felt a responsibility to check in with them, like asking, does it insult you to unravel a French horn because they're an object of importance to you? Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a final question in a moment, but we will have time for questions from the audience. So please, if you would like to ask a question, have it ready, and I'll ask you to unmute to do that. Or if you wish, you could put it in the chat and I can direct it. While you're perhaps chewing over that, I wanted to ask you more generally, Vic, about the medical humanities. I mean, something I've encountered, I guess, I first encountered the concept really in Britain, actually, when I was teaching in London a few years back, well, about 15 years ago now. And yeah, so, I mean, I'm interested in the idea that it begins as being rather doctor-centred, and it becomes, I think, perhaps more patient-centred. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on the medical humanities as a field and where you think it's going, where it might go from here.
Yeah. Well, I think, in those early days of thinking through, well, let's create opportunities for doctors to, say, visit a gallery and talk about the emotional quality of an artwork in order to train, I don't think train's the right word, but just expose or normalize conversations around affective sensorial experience and the importance of those in our world. To, on the other end, a critique of biomedicine, where the World Health Organization talks about biopsychosocial, that, health systems should be understanding the psychological and the social aspects of health, so not just a person's pathology, but their situation in life, their income concerns, all of this, are they at home, are they caring for 3 disabled children, or children with needs that need tended to? I think, this is medical goes to in sort of exploring all those things. I think from my perspective, or the part of it that I'm interested in, is around the interdisciplinarity. And so the facial nerve clinic in itself, before I arrived there for my PhD, was one of its strengths, and one of what makes it really an astonishing place is its multidisciplinarity. So all the different disciplines, medical disciplines that are there. But then through my presence, we expanded that concept to say, well, also with the physiotherapist and the speech pathologist and the eye surgeon, ear, throat and nose surgeon and plastic surgeons, contemporary artist. So I think, the idea that the medical humanities grows to understand that, again, we're not sort of antagonistically pushing against biomedical practices, but we're saying, we're just continuing that work of understanding the relationship between these things. And through something like the arts, we can, we have the potential to explore an aspect that's really important to the medical journey, which is the emotional and the psychological and the experiential aspect. But also, as we talked about, As one surgeon at the facial nerve clinic said to me sort of a couple of years in, I'm starting to see the clinical benefit of you being here, that you can bring back information to us as surgeons. We might not have the time, was how he put it, to find out about somebody. And so, you know, how in tandem we can use the arts or other disciplines, other modes, I think is the exciting aspect of what medical humanities can continue to not just theorize about and not just write papers about, but to actually enact in our clinical spaces.
Thanks, Vic. So are there any questions? Would anyone like to raise a question or make a comment now that we're sort of approaching the end of our hour? So please unmute if you would like to do that. Keen to hear from you. I don't see anyone doing that. So, oh, yes, we do. Susan, hello.
Hello there. I thought it's time to say, it's perhaps time to say hello. Thank you so much for a lovely, really broad-reaching interview, both of you tonight. It's been a real delight to listen to, and as with all parts of the time that I've worked with Vic, it encouraged me to look through Vic's practice and the things that he's accomplished, perhaps through another lens and a slightly different language. So I have probably a couple of reflections if they're of interest. I guess firstly, Vic talked about enrolling in the Faculty of Medicine and Health and some of the challenges in writing for a medical journal, or knowing that it had to have a certain shape that would mean that a medical marker could then immediately sort of get a network that they understood, and they were sort of expecting like an introduction and sort of like a method, and how did you do it, and what did you find, and to discuss that. And we certainly had some challenging discussions around that, but at the same time, it was always sort of like a mutual discussion about how the point was either buried or really brought forward in the argument, brought to the understanding of a broad range, or a broad range of people. But I think another couple of things that struck me tonight is, I guess as a physiotherapist, I've worked with people with facial nerve disorders for close on about 3 decades, and that's the area of my research as well. And you've been speaking about words such as empathy and trust, which is really where Vic and I started working together. And of course, when you see, so if I just tell you, I teach people to smile, I teach people to express emotion on their face. That's I have a lucky job. It's a great thing to do. So if I'm with a patient, and when you go to see a medical practitioner, what do you want them to do? You want them to understand you. And if in the very short beginning part of a consultation, which we could argue that first impressions are made in less than half a second, it's a very primitive thing, and they develop from there. But if in the early part of a conversation with a medical practitioner or a healthcare practitioner, if you don't have some degree of trust, some degree of empathy, some degree of understanding, mutual understanding, some degree of care, then as a patient, you're probably not going to actually tell that person all the things that are bothering you. And you're not really going to open up to that person. So I guess in closing, the things that were perhaps at times you talk about, or many people talk about the difference of arts and humanities and medical practice and these different disciplines. But at the core of many of these things, there's so many intersecting emotions, so many intersecting themes. And I found it a real pleasure to work with Vic, because he helped me understand things and perhaps look through the lens of different concepts in a really different way. So it was a real pleasure, but I've got to take you to task on one thing. You made the comment about, I can't capture your words now, but it was about the hanging of works on a wall. And I thought, well, one surprising day, Vic invited me into a studio and said, I want to photograph your hands. And he said, I want to photograph your hands and impose them on a picture of somebody with a facial paralysis. And in fact, they were quite large photographs that hung on a wall in Vic's exhibition. of the person who cared for that person with their hands. So I thought there was sort of an intriguing comment that made me think, well, actually, it probably does cross some of those pathways. But thank you for letting me reflect on Vic's lovely talk this evening.
Thanks so much, Susan. Vic, did you want to respond to Susan there, or?
Well, I can't remember the hanging conversation, but that that work was a really beautiful photographic work that talked about the intimacy of the relationship between a caregiver and a patient, and that the intimacy of what that means to use your hands to care for somebody, and I think that was what a number of the works we're doing was trying to sort of hone in on these really intimate experiences.
Thanks, Vic, and thanks, Susan. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to raise? Please feel free to unmute if you'd like to do that. I don't see anyone at the moment. So we are pretty close to time, but just one more question, Vic, of course. Inevitably, in these, this crossroads of having done the PhD and at Sydney University and this marvellous exhibition, just tell us a little bit, I guess, about what you're working on at the moment and projects that are going forward at present.
So I think there's lots of activity going on at the Cad Factory, and talking with Susan and Claire about sort of ongoing, still a lot of written work to happen from my PhD, and a lot of sort of expanding into sort of theories of socially engaged arts practice. I think we're also really interested in, helping to nurture a community of artists who are interested in this broad field of not just arts and health, but socially engaged practice. Us figuring out ways how we can share our experiences and provide opportunities for others to sort of grow in this area. And, a number of just interesting projects. We're spending time again up in Menindee and, taking a documentary we made about those shows on a river tour down various places along the Murray-Darling system. And so that will continue. And I think next week I find myself in Lightning Ridge down an opal mine working with the community up in Lightning Ridge. So always a diverse range from writing and thinking about theory and how is empathy not ethical, to thinking about art form and practice and making and supporting other practitioners too.
Great. Well, look, thanks so much, Vic, and for being such a generous interlocutor tonight. It's been a privilege for me to learn more about your work. Congratulations again, of course, on the prize, on the PhD. It's wonderful. Congratulations to all of the teams that you're working with on these various projects. Should also finish up by thanking Sally Daly for her support of CHASS generally and for tonight's event. It has been recorded and will in due course appear on CHASS's website. So if you would like to go back to it at some stage or recommend it to others, we'd be delighted, obviously, if you could do that. Without further ado, I just thank everyone for their participation tonight and wish you all a happy Social Sciences Week. So thank you to everyone.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Vic.
Thanks,
Thanks, Sally. Cheers.
Yeah.